Audio Jungle.
Welcome to Coffee Talk. I am your host, Mashuma Saba, M. Saba. This is our Cultural Variety Podcast. Stay tuned. Welcome to today's show, Coffee Talk Podcast, the Cultural Variety Podcast show. And tonight, we discuss the dance. That's right, cultural dances. So again, this is Coffee Talk Podcast, the Cultural Variety Podcast show. And I am your host, Mashuma Saba, M. Saba. And this is our Cultural Variety Podcast show. How y'all doing tonight? How y'all doing tonight? It is April 24th, 2023. I'm glad to be back. This is our Cultural Studies night. And tonight we're going to have we're going to open up interesting dialogue, I should say, as we have 3 short readings based on cultural dances and how they came about. We will be discussing the short story dances in the book called 1001 Things Everyone Should Do or Everyone Should Know About African American History. This book was written by Jeffrey C. Storer, or should I say put together, But this is the book right here. So for Cultural Studies Night, we're just going to dive into this book, 1001 Things Everybody Should Know About African American History. All right, so that's what we're going to do. And if this is your first time tuning into our show, this is a cultural studies show. It's actually a cultural variety show, I should say. But on alternate Sunday, Monday nights, we like to dig into our culture. We like to give big props to our doctors, our lawyers, our scholars, our people. And we do that by sharing poetry. We do that by sharing short stories. But that's what we do here on Coffee Talk Podcast, Monday night cultural studies night. All right, so I'm happy to be here. And this is going to be some reads where you can gather the children around, because it's always good to learn about our story. You know what I'm saying? So go ahead and make sure that you do you and get yourself prepared and definitely bring something along to sip on. So before we start our show, that leads me into what's today's flavor. Well, today's flavor is this. Remember the scene from Carlito's Way, and Carlito was sitting in the dance hall watching Gail serenade the dance floor? What would have been in your cup at that moment? What would you have been sipping on as you watch Gail serenade the dance floor? What you sipping on? What's the flavor? Well, today my flavor is a little wine cooler, 9%, strawberry hard lemonade. What's your flavor? What are you sipping on tonight? It could be anything from water to wine to coffee to a cappuccino to tea, whatever it is. But come on in, kick your feet up, and enjoy tonight's podcast, Cultural Variety Podcast show, Coffee Talk Podcast. All right, so tonight's flavor basically is any choice of yours, But I chose to drink on a wine cooler tonight. And as I was writing out that intro, I was thinking about Carlito's Way, man. You know what I mean? Because that was a deep scene right there. He was imagining that him and Gail was going to escape to Miami. And for that one moment, the pressure was lifted because he was so entranced into watching Gail serenade the dance floor. So I thought that would be kind of cool tonight. Typically when we do the flavor, we give you all kind of drinks. You know what I'm saying? So definitely enjoy. Also tonight's wise word. Tonight's wise word is from an author. It's from an artiste, and a writer that has written many essays. One of his great writings was a book called The Prophet, which he actually wrote in 1923. And this book is a poetry of 26 fables. And they've been translated in 100 different languages. So tonight's wise words is by the great Khalil Gibran, who was born in 1883 in Mount Lebanon, also known as Lebanon. And he came to the United States in 1885. And he is known for, again, his artistic works, his writings, his essays on life's gifts, and again, his most famous book writing called The Prophet. And in that book, a woman named Almitra had asked Khalil, she said, or asked the prophet, because it was in the book, a character by the name of Almitra, I apologize. Almitra said to the prophet, speak to us of love. Speak to us of love. And the prophet replied, when love beckons you to follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. When love beckons you to follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. Go ahead and allow that to marinate and see what that brings to you. You know what I'm saying? But that is Khalil Gibran, who actually wrote the book, The Prophet. But those are not the wise words for the night. The wise words for the night, as we do it here at Coffee Talk Podcast, is this. Khalil Gibran stated, we are limited not by our abilities, but by our vision. We are limited not by our abilities, but by our vision. So there's nothing that can stop you but you. You're not limited by your abilities, especially if you have all your limbs and your senses. But you can be limited in what you inspire to set out to do because your vision is cloudy. So that's what I get when I listen to the wise words of tonight, Khalil Gibran. Again, artist and writer, poet. And that's his wise words. All right. So again, welcome to Coffee Talk Podcast, the Coastal Variety Podcast. And this is a chill night. So if you're tuning into the podcast tonight and you're saying, man, I need some hyper, I gotta get some hyper. What is he talking about? This is not that night. This night is for people that are intellectuals, people that want to unwind from a busy Monday, people that love to hear great stories. That's what this is for tonight. That's what the flavor is. Coffee Talk Podcast. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. We're talking about dancing. And the introduction is called The Atlantic Tradition of Dance. the Atlantic tradition of dance. Let's go ahead and read it. Traditional African dances crossed the Atlantic with the slave trade, landed in the Caribbean, and flourished. Generally, African culture met with less overt opposition from the white planter class in the Caribbean than on the mainland of North America, and was able to maintain itself more freely and for a longer time in the West Indies. Conditions of life in West Indian slavery, absentee, white ownership of plantations, consequently, a low level of concern by whites about the recreational activities of the slaves. Frequent arrivals of new Americans due to the higher mortality rate of slaves in the West Indies and the numerical superiority of blacks over whites aided the retention of African culture. Although different African peoples preferred particular dance traditions, four major dances were widespread in the Caribbean. The Kalinda, performed by several couples who circled one another, was a shuffling advance and retreat between partners who moved mainly with their hips. The Chica involved mainly the rotation of the hips while the rest of the body was immobilized. The Bambula, likely an offshoot of the Chica, was named after the Bambula drum and performed by a couple inside of a ring. The Juba was a dance of competition and skill. The Juba was a dance of competition and skill in which a woman, moving slowly with shuffling feet and contorted limbs, challenged several men to enter the ring and best her dancing, often with the result that retired exhausted. Although such dances flourished in the West Indies and drew African American choreographers such as Catherine Durham to the islands to study them in the 1930s, some variations of them made it to North America. The Chica spread with the West Indian migration to New Orleans, while the Juba was danced in selected areas of the southern United States. Music and dance for the masters. Although African American musicians were rarely known nationwide in the 17th century, they did perform regularly within the slave quarters and at the plantation owners' homes, also known as the big houses. When guests visited the plantations, masters often summoned slaves to play music and dance. On these occasions, certain dances were considered appropriate entertainment for the white folks. The bucking wing was often performed on such occasion. The wing, sometimes referred to as the pigeon wing. In this dance, slaves flapped their arms and legs and held their head and neck stiff like a bird. Some slaves performed the Irish jig so well as to be entered in the contest with the slaves of other masters. The cakewalk, in which couples walked on a straight path with sharp, precise turns, was often danced by slaves at harvest time. Its name derived from the traditions on some plantations where the mistress would award a cake as a prize to the couple who had danced the best. Some learned to play music and dance so well that they allowed to teach others and to participate in parades for events such as Election Day, a carryover from the days before captivity in which slaves chose their own officials. Mm, mm, mm. Dirty dancing. Dirty dancing. Some dances was considered too risque to be performed in front of the masters, and thus were generally confined to private occasions in the slave quarters. One dance considered particularly primitive was the ring dance, which resembled the Congo dances of West Indians. Following a circular path, slaves danced individually in an animated shuffle that vibrated the entire body. Another popular dance was the buzzard lope, an animal dance that retained African tradition and sought to represent the behavior of a turkey buzzard, carrying on about a hen. The water dance was performed by slaves who danced while carrying a bucket of glass of water on their heads. This dance looks back to the African traditions of carrying goods on their heads. The West Indian Juba became known as the Juba in the United States and was a secular dance in which participants patted out the Juba by clapping, slapping one's chest, thighs, or legs when drums was prohibited. The Juba became the renowned hambone dance in modern times. House servant dances. Caste divisions exited among slaves in the South and were reflected in the kinds of dances that the house servant would perform. Given that the house servants on large plantations in the South often thought of themselves as superior to the field servants, these domestic servants performed dances that integrated West African dance elements with steps from the English square dances and the French quadrille. In New Orleans and Charleston, house servants and the free persons of color who occupied the brown societies of those cities held balls and cotillions, which were dignified dances as their figure dance and the 16th figure dance were popular. There's some things that I want to talk about, y'all. So may you be writing down some questions as well, because we're definitely going to open up dialogue as soon as we're done here. Last story. Masters' ambivalence towards dancing. While some masters believed that encouraging dance among their slaves was an effective way to keep them happy and contented, other masters refused to allow slaves to hold such dance on their plantations. Some of these masters allowed their slaves to travel to other plantations for dances, but others would not, a restriction that posed difficulties for slaves who enjoyed dancing. Some slaves, however, found ingenious ways to surmount these obstacles. In 1937, a former plantation slave interviewed by the Alabama Writers Project recalled that young Massa told Tom one time not to go to the frolic. Tom said, yes, sir. But Massa Nip watched Tom do and alter while Tom slip out and away he went with young Massa right behind him. He got there and found Tom cutting ground, shuffling big as anybody. Young Massa called him, Tom, he say, Tom, didn't I tell you you couldn't come to this frolic? Yes, sir, says Tom. You sure did, and I just come tell him I couldn't come. So that was an interview of a slave, and I did my best interpretation of talking the way they have it spelled out due to those times. And that was a slave interview by the Atlanta Writers Project back in 1937. You know, see, They didn't want to, there were several reasons why they didn't want to go to take their slaves from one plantation to another to dance. One was the chances of escape, and the other was the fact that dance is something that can seduce you, especially our dances, because our dances have always been spiritually connected. But during those times, you have to think that if the master took his best dancers to a plantation with other great dancers, sometimes in dance, the energy alone can connect one another. And if a child was born or something went on through that outside of trying to escape, the masters would argue over who gets to keep the woman and child at that point. And if you're on somebody else's plantation, they kept your child and your woman. This is just an interesting story that we share tonight here on Coffee Talk Podcast. And I want to get your thoughts on dances that you heard tonight. The Juba, the what are the other names that we went over here? Several different names that we went about. Let go ahead and leave a comment. Let me know what dances you remember. The Chica, the Bambula, the Juba. Today we have dances that have come and go. The Smurf, the Troop, the Moonwalk, shaking your hips, twerking. What is your thoughts on dance? The origins of it, the history of it. Is there a good or a bad to it? Go ahead and leave your comments. Let us know what your thoughts are. When you see professional dancers, how does that make you feel? Have you ever been um, to see anyone dance? What other dances have you been to? Go ahead and leave a comment. But other than that, before we get ready to leave you here at Coffee Talk Podcast, I want to say, may you have enjoyed our short story. This is our cultural studies night. So what are you doing at this time? Are you listening to the podcast? Are you reading? Are you preparing for tomorrow? Are you getting the kids' clothes together? Are you just finishing up dinner? Go ahead and leave a comment. Let us know what you are doing tonight. If you want to share any affirmations, definitely go ahead and put that in the comments as well. But we enjoy having you here at Coffee Talk Podcast. And like I said, this is our cultural studies night. And when I say culture, it's such a broad word for us because, we are the original people. But what we try to do here at Coffee Talk Podcast is we try to give you, the viewers, the supporters that listen to the show, just culture. We try to give you culture, positive culture. Because we know today that our news media is bombarded with so much negative energy. So we want you to be able to escape. And even if that just means it's a 30-minute show, just be able to escape and unwind and reflect and close your eyes and hear some stories of some trials and some tribulations of our great people. These are stories that you don't hear every day in the universities or in the high schools or in the elementary schools. So what we did is we created a day as part of our podcast schedule to make sure that we empower not only the youth, not only the young adults, but also our elderly. And this is how we give back to our community by giving you stories that you don't hear every day. So, with that being said, I would like to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for tuning in to Coffee Talk Podcast. You know where to get it. Come and get the flavor. This is the Cultural Variety Podcast Show. I'm going to hit you with the universal peace sign. And check us out Wednesday as we talk about the fight. Javante Tank Davis and Ryan Garcia. We was going to talk about that tonight, but we don't interrupt our schedule. But Wednesday, we're talking about the fight, man. We're going to dig deep into that fight, too. A lot of y'all was hating it. We didn't forget. Thank you for tuning in to Coffee Talk Podcast. It's your host, Mashuma Saba, M. Saba, and it's our Cultural Variety Podcast Show. Peace. We out of here. Thank you.